Have you just harvested your onions and now have an empty garden bed? Don't leave that space sitting empty for the rest of the season. If you still have some growing time left, that same bed can produce another harvest before cold weather arrives. Instead of letting weeds take over, you can grow fresh greens, herbs, and even another vegetable crop. This is one of the easiest ways to get more from the garden without creating more garden space. After harvesting our onions, we cleaned up the bed, removed the weeds, and prepared the rows for a second crop. The soil was already there. The rows were ready. So instead of leaving the bed empty, we decided to plant several crops that can still produce a harvest later in the season. And the first one we planted was arugula. We used wild Sylvetta arugula, which is a great option when you want something that can produce more than one harvest. We also planted another variety called Rocket. And then we added an early maturing arugula variety. The idea is simple. Don't think that the gardening season is finished just because one crop has been harvested. A bed that was growing onions can immediately become a bed for another crop. Next, we planted cilantro. Cilantro is another option for using this empty space instead of letting weeds grow. Then we moved on to lettuce. We planted several types, including a simple leaf lettuce and an early variety called Snowflake. This type can reach harvest stage relatively quickly, which makes it especially useful when you're planting after another crop has already been harvested. And that's something worth remembering. When you're planting a second crop, you don't want to choose something that needs an extremely long growing season. You want crops that can grow and give you something to harvest while there is still enough time left in the season. That's why fast-growing greens can be such a useful choice. We also planted spinach. Spinach can make excellent use of an open garden bed after an earlier crop has been removed. And of course, we couldn't forget dill. Dill can sometimes reseed itself in the garden, but we also planted another variety because we wanted to make use of the space right away. Another option we planted was green onion. We used bunching onion, which can provide green leaves later in the season. And even if the plants don't produce everything we want before the cold weather arrives, they can continue growing and provide an early crop the following spring. So an empty onion bed doesn't necessarily have to be finished for the year. It can become the starting point for your next harvest. But there was one more crop we wanted to try: early cabbage. This was something we hadn't tried in this situation before, but we decided to use some of the available space for an early cabbage variety. The goal was to have fresh cabbage later in the season, something we could use for salads and cooking. And this is exactly why succession planting can be so useful. You don't necessarily need more land. Sometimes you just need to use the land you already have more than once. You harvest one crop, clear the bed, prepare the soil, and plant something else. Instead of harvesting onions and then watching weeds take over the garden, you can turn that same space into another productive part of the garden. And you don't have to plant the entire bed with just one crop. You can divide it into sections. A few rows of arugula, a few rows of lettuce, some spinach, cilantro, dill, green onions. And if you have enough time left in your growing season, you can even experiment with another vegetable, such as early cabbage. This also gives you the opportunity to grow things that you might not have had room for earlier in the season. So next time you pull your onions from the ground, don't immediately think that the garden bed is finished. Look at the calendar. Look at how much growing season you have left. And think about what you can plant next, because that empty bed may still have another harvest waiting for you. One garden bed doesn't have to mean one harvest. With a little planning, you can harvest your onions and then use that same space to grow something completely different. And sometimes, that second harvest can be the easiest one of the season. But there is one more thing to keep in mind when planting a second crop. Before you put new seeds into the soil, take a good look at the garden bed. Remove the old roots and plant material that is no longer useful, clear away the weeds, and make sure the soil is ready for the next crop. You don't need to completely rebuild the garden bed every time you harvest something. The goal is simply to give the new plants a clean place to grow. And this is where succession planting becomes really interesting. You can start thinking about your garden as a cycle instead of a single season. One crop grows. You harvest it. The space opens up. And another crop goes in. That means the garden can keep producing food even after your first crops are finished. For example, onions may take up part of your garden during the first part of the season. Once they're harvested, that same area can become a place for leafy greens. And greens are especially useful because you don't necessarily need to wait months to start harvesting them. You can pick young leaves as they grow and continue harvesting while the plants develop. This is also a great way to experiment. You don't have to plant an entire bed with one crop. Try several varieties and see which ones perform best in your own garden. Maybe one type of arugula grows faster. Maybe one lettuce variety handles the changing weather better. Maybe spinach gives you a much bigger harvest than you expected. By planting several things, you get to learn what works best in your particular conditions. And that information becomes even more valuable next season. Another thing I like about this approach is that it helps keep the garden productive without making the work much more complicated. The bed has already been prepared. The weeds have already been removed. The soil is already there. You're simply giving that space another job. And if you have several garden beds, you can plan this even further. Instead of harvesting everything at once and then leaving the garden empty, you can stagger your plantings. One bed can be growing onions. Another can be producing garlic. Another can be ready for greens. And when one crop is finished, you already know what is going in next. This kind of planning can make a surprisingly big difference, especially if you grow a lot of your own food. You don't always need a bigger garden. Sometimes you just need to get more harvests from the garden you already have. And there is one more reason I wouldn't leave an empty bed sitting untouched. Weeds. Give them an empty garden bed with plenty of sunlight and they won't waste any time moving in. Instead of spending weeks fighting weeds later, you can use the space for something you actually want to grow. So when you finish harvesting your onions, don't just look at the empty rows. Look at the time you have left. Look at the weather. And think about what can still grow. Maybe it's arugula. Maybe lettuce. Maybe spinach. Maybe cilantro or dill. Maybe green onions. And if your conditions allow it, you might even have time for another vegetable crop. The important thing is to choose something that makes sense for the remaining growing season. And that's really the secret to getting more from your garden. Don't think only about the first harvest. Think about what comes after it. Because the end of one crop can be the beginning of another. A garden bed that looks finished today can be full of fresh green plants again tomorrow. And when you finally harvest that second crop, you'll realize just how much more productive the same piece of soil can be. So next time you pull your onions from the ground, don't rush to put that bed to sleep. Clean it up, prepare the rows, choose a fast-growing crop, and give that space another chance to produce. Your garden may have more time left than you think.